To come and tell you about some interesting work. It's interesting that as we do more and more single-sided deafness studies, and we do more single-sided deaf children, it's fascinating to me that we're learning more about the cochlea. So yesterday I talked about a number of things, and I introduced the concept of how important CMV was, and that's something we learned because of single-sided deafness and treating it experimentally. And so today I'm going to talk about asymmetric deafness, including single-sided deafness, and how that is let us have some understanding of the underlying mechanisms. It's auto-advancing. I'm not sure why. You got it? Thanks. Okay. So my team, of course, you met them yesterday, and they do all the work that I'm going to present today. So I'm talking today about the concept of symmetry in the auditory system. I'm talking about symmetry in labyrinthine. Remember, the labyrinth is the balance organ and the auditory cochlea organ. And that both of these organs are one. They are a combined thing. It's only us that divides them into cochlear, vestibular. You heard us talk about vestibular earlier, but it's one organ, and they develop together, and they affect the percept and how we perceive the world together, because they were formed to find, where am I in space? Where is food? Where is safety? Where do I go for the things I need in life? It's an orienting system that only in the last few thousand years has been used for communication directly. And so when there's an asymmetry in the way that this system is formed, it has a defect in the percept and the outcome. And that's really, in single-sided deafness and asymmetric deafness, bimodal fittings, in the last decade, I've learned a lot about, with my team, how the auditory system functions. So let me share that, because symmetrical incoming information allows you to combine both sides and get this depth perception, so you can see the vase or the faces. The binaurality allows you to fuse the two sides, and that allows you to reassemble the world that's around you, and that takes a lot of effort. And if it's difficult to do, it takes more effort. And so your school performance will go down because you're spending so much of your energy just perceiving. So the key to this lecture is understanding that humans hunt language. That's what we're interested in. We've spent the last many thousands of years improving our audition, our language, and our ability to make decisions at the expense of smell, vision, and motor skill. That's why we can't catch a fish, because they've spent the last thousands of years trying to find out when we're trying to catch them. But we hunt language, and that's what we do. And in this symmetric concept that I'm trying to tell you, we're trying to find where things are coming from. We're trying to localize the position of the sound source using timing and loudness, and effortfully reassemble it. And that becomes much more difficult when we're only hearing from one side and have asymmetric perception, especially if it's a fluctuating hearing loss. So Judy Liu, who's a good friend of mine, presented that the unilateral hearing loss has significant problems: quality of life problems, grade failure, speech saver behavior, school performance, all these things. And she says it's because of unilateral hearing loss, and I say, I don't think so. I think it's not exclusively auditory. When you hear and balance in a three-dimensional space, you develop something called spatial intelligence. You develop a sense of where you are, and language is part of it, because all these things that feed into spatial intelligence, your joint space, your if you're moving, vision, hearing, vestibular, all contribute. And this efference copy is very important, because you have to know something is there. Then when you move it, you can go, I moved it. If you don't have a copy of where the world is in space, you can't understand movement within it. And language is movement. Because this sentence, which now started 4 seconds ago, will go into space, and I'll refer to when I started it 10 seconds ago, and no, even then I was going to end it now. That's a three-dimensional concept. And unless I develop spatial intelligence when I'm a baby, I'm never going to be able to develop that degree of language and the ability to go back and forth in space. Language is a three-dimensional percept. It's a spatial intelligence. So let's look at that. You already heard earlier, Dr. Habab earlier showed that this work by our group showed that a lot of kids commonly have dysfunction in not only the anterior, but the posterior labyrinth. And these kids have dysfunction, sometimes complete areflexia. No surprise. The same mechanisms that deafen the auditory system deaf in the Labyrinthine system. And we compare them to normal, and we do this, it's called the Brunick-Ostrowski test. It's a balanced subset, and there's normal, there's children with hearing loss, and a significant portion actually have bilateral vestibular loss. But that's not my point. My point is that compared to normal hearing, doing this Brunick-Ostrowski test, which is hierarchical, more difficult tests over there, children with bilateral loss have significant problems. So do children with unilateral loss. At the most difficult tests, there's significant difference. They don't do as well. So even unilateral deafness has some component of balance abnormality. Is that important in school? Yeah, because you're reading. And if you can't keep a line on a page as well as someone who has two normal balance systems, you're at a disadvantage when you're learning to read. So we're getting into it now. This asymmetry is what's about the asymmetry. It's the whole organ, the labyrinth, the cortex. This asymmetry, as we dig deeper into it, we start to see some interesting things that might explain why children with single-sided deafness or asymmetric loss are having trouble putting the world together. Takes more effort, they're more tired, don't do as well in school. So I've shown you, or I've tried to show you, that the vestibular system is an important thing with respect to developing spatial intelligence, and you have to develop these things while you're growing, because that's when your brain is figuring them out. How about hearing? Well, when I talk, as I commonly do, about bilateral implantation, I tell you that simultaneous or short sequential is best because all the waves line up, and so that everything lines up, and then you can fuse the images more easily, and you can have a symmetrical percept. And it makes sense then if you have asymmetry with a bimodal, because one acoustic, one electric, you have all these differences, and the brain can't put it together as readily. So it makes sense if there's asymmetry in the auditory system, both at the brainstem and in the cortex, they will have problems putting this information together. Now, normally the right cortex sees the left ear, the left cortex sees the right ear. They cross. These things cross. And when you see children, you stimulate them, that's what you see in normal, simultaneous, and short sequential implanted children. But in children who have a long delay between the first side and the second side, or single-sided deaf, the right ear sees this ear, and this cortex also sees this ear. Everything is shifted to the only remaining ear. Makes sense. If there's a deaf ear, both sides of the brain look at the hearing ear. It makes sense. It's very hard to pull that back to normal. It's called abnormal auditory preference. Let me explain it to you. So normally, the cortex sees the side on the opposite side. So the cortex sees the opposite side. These are normal hearing children, so of course they do. And if there's any function in the gray area, that means the brain is being shifted to the wrong side. And not surprisingly, the longer time between, these are simultaneously implanted children, the longer the sequential implant, the more likely the brain has abnormal aural preference. That just makes sense. Simultaneous, short delay, long delay. Makes sense. And the more asymmetric the brain, just like in the vestibular system, the more asymmetric the auditory brain, the less able to fuse, the less able to put the information together. The reassembly is more effortful. The child is more tired. They don't do as well in school. The story's starting to happen. Now, this is the aural preference curve for both ears at once. And it shows that normal hearing children, of course, have normal aural preference. Of course they do. And simultaneously implanted children, normal aural preference. Of course they do. Children with long sequential implants, depending on how long they were implanted, can have abnormal aural preference. And of interest, I'll tell you that I followed these children for 15 years, and I have never returned aural preference to normal. So once this spatial intelligence has been disturbed while it's developing, it can never be restored. For speech perception, just quickly to show you, of course, simultaneously implanted children don't prefer either ear. Children with a sequential implant prefer the first ear in most cases. But it doesn't matter which ear they prefer. They're not the same. So they're asymmetric. So they take more energy to put the world together, more tired, poorer in school. That's the story. And clearly, the more asymmetry is found the farther you are between the first and second implant. Okay, so this little girl has bilateral implants, and I just took off one of her implants. That's all I did. On this side, I took off one of her implants. That's all I did. She's got both implants here. I just took one off acutely. And it's not a scientific experiment. I'm just showing you. I've altered her auditory environment, and just by altering her auditory environment and nothing else, I've changed her balance. Because it takes more work to find that beam. I don't know how she does it anyway, but look at that. Not an experiment. Paul, don't have to video. I'll give you the original. So hearing also impairs the ability for spatial intelligence. Right? So vestibular impairs it, hearing impairs it. These things impair the ability for you to develop the spatial intelligence. Let's look at some other stuff. Vision. Well, when I do 1 foot standing, eyes open, eyes closed, the children with hearing loss, the unilateral hearing loss, do better when their eyes are open, showing that vision helps compensate, but doesn't completely compensate. And so vision might have some ability. You can see how these things are interrelated. I'll show you how they're interrelated. This group of children in the balance test, there's normal. Children who have normal hearing, normal balance function, have poor balance if they have strabismus or amblyopia, just because they have one eye that didn't work and they developed spatial intelligence with one eye only. Same findings, I didn't show it. Child with normal vision, normal balance, normal hearing, but in a wheelchair, impaired. Because they never developed spatial intelligence with 2 symmetrical systems. Fascinating. So it's probably not exclusively auditory. It probably has to do with fusion and effort, and this slow processing fatigues the system because it takes more energy to reassemble the world if it's asymmetric. That means you don't do as well in school. So it coexists, hearing loss coexists with deficits in vestibular system, and labyrinthine deficits increase the cognitive load. Okay, well, we know the brain has auditory development with cochlear implants, and we also know the brain has executive function. This is the P2, increases with the longer time we use a cochlear implant, and we know that a whole bunch of non-auditory areas are turned on with cochlear implants, so we know that there's this huge cognitive effort to understand the world. And we know now that any asymmetry makes that worse. So our latest series of experiments are looking at working memory in children who have normal hearing, 2 implants, or 1 untreated side of deafness. And this is just the Corsi block test where they have to touch a bunch of blocks and then remember and then do it backwards. It's a working memory. It has nothing to do with balance or hearing. But when we do this test, the children with untreated single-sided deafness are clearly poorer than normal, and they're actually about the same as a bilaterally implanted group. And in some other tests, which are stunning to me, the untreated single-sided are actually poorer than bilaterally implanted children. So when we're looking at single-sided cochlear implantation, we're looking at whether if we implant a single-sided deaf child less than age 2, we can restore the normal developmental trajectory for symmetrical spatial intelligence development. That's happening. Oh, of interest. In my last minute, let me tell you something exciting. I told you I've never reversed oral preference from abnormality to normal in 15 years of following children who had long sequential implants. This is a group of 5 children who did not have CMV, who were implanted with single-sided deafness. Of course, you can see their oral preference is all over the map. That's what I'd predict. But what I couldn't have predicted, that it returned to normal within 6 months. So we're restoring normal developmental trajectory. Will that have an effect? This is their brain waves going back to normal as we follow them with our filtered EEG. Asymmetric labyrinthine function impairs balance function. Development impacts the spatial perception and intelligence. It has an effect on language. Will single-sided implantation restore some degree of symmetry? I don't know. I'll tell you as soon as I find out, but it's been very exciting looking. Thanks for your attention.